I'm Emma.
And I'm Helena, and we both work at the MS Trust. Just a little disclaimer, we're still recording this over Zoom, so apologies if the sound is iffy at any stage. Please do bear with us.
We'd like to welcome you to our podcast, Multiple Sclerosis, Breaking It Down. And this week we're going to be attacking the hot topic, literally if you suffer from hot flashes, of menopause, particularly menopause and MS.
And menopause has really gone from not being talked about at all to being the topic of last year. Well, if we're not talking about COVID, obviously. Not long before we started recording this, BBC shared a news story about a consultation which is looking at the possibility of HRT being available as an over-the-counter medicine. However, there's still taboos around the subject of menopause. Did you ever learn about it in school, Emma? They didn't talk about it in my school at all.
No, I didn't actually. To be completely honest with you, when we first talked about doing this podcast on the menopause and MS, I was a bit nervous because I didn't actually know a single thing about it. So obviously, luckily, Google exists and I was able to head over to the internet to have a little bit of a scout around. But I just think it's really crazy because as someone myself who has periods, I'm obviously pretty much guaranteed to go through the menopause. And yet I have no, before now anyway, I had no clue about it. But things like sexual health and childbirth are sort of discussed in schools, and yet they are actually personal choice when it comes down to them.
Yeah, it seems to be crazy because I've, like yourself, even though I'm a bit older than you and I'm heading that way sooner rather than later, if not already there. I was also doing a bit of cramming before and reading up on it, and everyone just says, it's not talked about in school. And it just seems absolutely crazy because, it's weird that it's sort of something shameful about it as well, because, it's going to happen to approximately 50% of the world's population.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, hopefully things will start changing because of more people talking about it. There's the brilliant documentary that was done by Davina McCall, and just more and more people coming out and speaking about their experiences. So hopefully the world's starting to open up a little bit about it.
Talking about menopause, and obviously this being an MS podcast, why is the connection with MS then? Well, even if you're not a person who is having periods, and talking to the men out there who are listening as well, a lot of the symptoms of menopause are very similar, and perimenopause are similar to MS symptoms. There's such a brain fog, incontinence, trouble sleeping, which are all MS symptoms. So what's what? And is it MS or is it menopause? And how do we treat it?
Yeah, and obviously they're not the only ones. The one that you hear a lot about is hot flashes. And obviously we know some people's MS actually gets worse with different temperatures. So there's quite a lot to discuss, really.
So we're going to be busy today. So first we're going to be chatting to a person with MS who's going through menopause. And then later on, we'll also talk to Ruth Dobson, who is a consultant neurologist with a special interest in menopause and MS.
So let's kick off by hearing about some of Hettie's experiences with menopause and MS. So lovely to chat with you today. Thank you for joining me. Could you start off by telling me a little bit about your MS diagnosis and the beginning of your journey?
Yeah, I was diagnosed quite a long time ago now, 1998, February the 13th, day sticks in my mind. And it was following on from... I was a PE teacher, and it's following on really from I lost the use of my legs and had fizziness and buzzing sensations, altered sensations in my hands and arms. And my husband was working nights, and we were about to move home, so we were living with my parents. My parents had gone away. I got two young children, and I rang the doctor because I couldn't feel sensations from my elbows down and my knees down. And I rang the doctor, and I'd bought some new trainers the day before, and I'd umpired a hockey match, and I kept stumbling when I was umpiring. And I thought it was something to do with the laces had been tight because my feet were really fizzy. rang the doctor, and the doctor said, "Oh, it's do you eat meat? Are you?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm a vegetarian." And he says, "It sounds like you've got something called a B12 deficiency, that sort of fizzy sensation." He says, "Have you got anything in the house?" And I said, "Well, I've got some Marmite." And he said, "Right, take some Marmite." So I took some Marmite, and he says, "If you're not feeling better in the morning, you need to come in." So obviously went to bed that night, worried what was going to happen overnight, didn't know what was going to happen, didn't ring my husband. He came in off nights, and I couldn't get out of bed. And so he walked into me sort of in a bit of a mess. So very quickly, it sort of escalated then. I ended up going into hospital and seeing luckily a neurologist. And I had a lumbar puncture at Christmas. This was the end of October, beginning of November. By Christmas, I'd had an MRI scan, which had shown one tiny little lesion on my brain, but I'd fallen off a horse years before, and the neurologist said that could have been a head injury I'd had. So he said, if we're going to find out what's wrong with you, do you really want to know? I was like, yes, I do really want to know. And he said, right, we'll have to do a lumbar puncture. So they took me in just before Christmas, did a lumbar puncture, and the results came back that there was, I think it's protein they find in your spinal cord or something. And he said, I'm sorry to tell you, you've got MS. And I didn't know what MS was. Yeah. But I was relieved, because I'd looked at all sorts of things, and I honestly didn't think I was going to make it. So when he said I got MS, it was like, okay, so what's that? Is it a life sentence, a death sentence? Where are we? And basically, I went into full panic, because I was a PE teacher, very successful, 2 young children, husband who worked shift work, firefighter, and moving home, and my legs didn't work. So that was really where my diagnosis sort of started.
And you said you hadn't really heard of MS before your diagnosis. Were there sort of any research bits that you did? Did you have a look around on Google, or sort of?
Yes, but bear in mind, this is a long time ago, isn't it? It's 1998. So using the internet like we do now wasn't what you did. It was tended to be more books and a bit of internet. But I did go on the internet and I did search, and it was very scary.
So are you okay to tell us a little bit about when you first realised that you were going through the menopause?
Well, that's an interesting one. And I think if you ask most ladies of a certain age, that is an interesting one, because I would not have said I was going through my menopause. I had no idea that what I was experiencing was my menopause until probably about 2 to 3 years ago. And now, with the knowledge I have now and the understanding I have now, I would say I was going through my menopause from my early 40s. But nobody around me even thought that was what it was. And I think one of the problems is that a lot of the symptoms of the menopause mirror MS symptoms, to the point that I've actually become now quite passionate about the confusion between the menopause and MS, and maybe the correlation between the two as well. It's frightening how many symptoms mirror themselves in both conditions. So yes, I would say, the sweats. I've always had a problem with temperature control and part of my MS has been this problem with temperature control. So I've often sweated, but then when I hit the menopause, which I didn't realize that's what it was, my sweating was uncontrollable. It was uncontrollable. I dripped. We bought the most huge fan, and my poor husband would go to bed in a bobble hat and woolly socks because I was so wet and so hot. I would change the sheets. I would lie on towels. that was more towards the end, really, the last few years, whereas at the early stages I was just getting very hot and clammy and sort of sweaty. But I thought it was just my MS getting worse, my symptoms getting worse. The skin, I couldn't bear to be touched, and that included clothing. Anything that would brush against me that I wasn't expecting, it would, like, I get what's called an electric shock, a Lemaire's phenomenon when I flex my neck. And it was like getting that when people touched me, clothes touched me, I accidentally brushed against something, it would literally make me jump. You can imagine in a marriage, that's not ideal. So obviously that causes problems as well. The mood swings, well, with MS, I do think that's an area that's not probably researched enough. There is a problem, I think, with mood control. I think there is something that for some people gets damaged or is affected, and you can swing quite violently in moods, and also feel things quite intensely emotionally. Now, that might be my personality, just my personality, but I don't remember it as a very young child being a very moody person. Maybe, busy lives, I don't know. But an MS and the menopause both exacerbate, I think, that. So that was a big problem. And anxiety, huge anxiety. Weight gain, massive, huge. Bearing in mind, very fit and active person, despite my MS, as well as my MS. But the weight gain was horrific. It was like I had to shovel food into my mouth, and it was always carbs. It was crisps, it was chips, it was bread. I mean, shoveling it in, disgusting. But that was another thing that I couldn't control. I just had to eat. It was like drive within me. I don't really like chips, and it's not something I'm a crisp eater, yes, but not a chip eater, and I suddenly really like chips. So that was probably a problem in terms of, was that MS, was that the menopause?
Right? Yeah, I think when I had a look, some of the symptoms that they said were like sleep problems, incontinence, pain, brain fog, tingling, and itchy skin, which, like you say, all cross over to MS.
Every single one. Painful, swollen, lumpy breasts, loads and loads of cysts. So that was definitely menopause, not MS. So that sort of the things that I sort of put down to the menopause now, when I look back at it, are my irregular, massively heavy periods, and my painful, swollen, lumpy breasts and benign sort of cysts. But actually, when you look at all the other things, what were they? Are they? And I think it was, in the end, for me, the only way I could come up with a sort of solution. I've not been on any drugs for MS for 10 to 15 years, which is another story. But I decided I had to go onto HRT, because when I saw my doctors, they were just offering me something called amitriptyline, which I think was to help with the sweating and the anxiety. But they didn't. I've got a history of breast cancer in the family, and they weren't positive or proactive about HRT. Basically, I was told it wasn't for me. And my husband was at the end of his tether. And in the end, I paid privately. And she said, I think you need to go on HRT. We talked about research, because I think there needs to be more research in MS and the menopause, because having talked to her, I felt a lot of my symptoms could be either my MS could be exacerbated by my menopause, or were the menopause and not my MS. So I went on to HRT coming up 3 months ago. I can't believe the difference. Cannot believe the difference in my MS, menopause, whatever it is, my symptoms. I had a horrific relapse in July, which again is another story, but down to various things that happened in my life. And I lost the use totally. I was unable to walk, so I lost motor function. I became totally incontinent, doubly incontinent. really bad, really, really bad. And obviously I've been battling to come back from that. And I went on to, and when I saw my neurologist, he poo-pooed the idea of me trying HRT. He said I needed to go on a disease modifying therapy to help my MS. And when I spoke to Dr. Newson, she said, but you need to give HRT a chance, and then you can then look at your disease modifying therapy. So I was stuck between two doctors. One doctor saying, I would really like you to try HRT and see how much that helps you and what it alleviates. And another doctor, both specialists in their fields, and another doctor who's an MS specialist saying to me, your HRT is not going to impact on your MS at all. It's not going to have any impact. So that was really hard to make that decision. And I decided I would try HRT for a few months and see what happened, as well as doing my exercise, my diet, all the nutrition and everything to try and help myself get back to being ambulant again. And it's made a difference. And I have started last week a DMT, whatever you call them, because I have been persuaded that it's like an insurance policy to help my disease, because there's been so much damage now in my spinal cord, to help my disease sort of hold where it is now.
And when you made the decision to go on another DMD, was it something that you were sort of advised to consider, like how that would work with your HRT, or did they not really talk about that sort of impact?
No, I raised it. Would there be any conflict between being on an HRT and a DMD? And the neurologist just said, I don't think so, not that I'm aware of. And that was it. The MS nurse was much more helpful, and she said, no, I think it's really good, and I think having both would really work for you. She was very insistent that I did what I felt. She knows I'm quite a sort of, I like to control everything, and she was very insistent that I did my own research with her support, and then did what I felt most comfortable with, because as I say, I haven't been on a DMD for nearly 15 years, and everyone I've tried I've reacted to. So it was a big decision to go on a DMD.
Yeah, I can imagine. And like you say, when they said to you, obviously go off and do your own research, was that quite difficult? Because as we've sort of mentioned already, there's not that much research or information out there about menopause and the MS. Sorry.
No, but the MS Society did some research, I can't remember, 2015, 13, 14, somewhere around there, that was really useful, but they hadn't got enough data to say whether HRT did help with the menopause, but there was some data to suggest it might. And my research really was down the estrogen route. And when I look back now, as my menopause was hitting and my estrogen levels were dropping, my MS symptoms were getting worse. So I do think it's a bit of a symbiotic relationship between hormones and your MS. And I remember when I was pregnant with my children, I was really well, but when I had my MS started really officially after the birth of my second child. And I think that there is some evidence to suggest that when you have MS and you are pregnant, you seem to be quite well, but you can sort of hold off relapses, and maybe afterwards you can get a little dip afterwards. So I think there's something in it. That's what I believe.
No, that's fair enough. I think there are, like you say, a few studies that sort of indicate that, and it's just getting awareness out there, doing a bit more research, and hopefully we'll get some sort of answers at some point.
Well, I know Dr. Newson is very, very keen to get involved in research, because one of the reasons she saw me was because I was pushing for research with MS and the menopause, and that was one of the reasons she saw me, because she said, well, I said, I'm a prime candidate here to see whether there is any benefit for taking HRT when you hit your menopausal time, as well as maybe, or instead of, or complementing with a DMD and lifestyle choices.
So I'm sure many of our listeners are aware of the study that was carried out a few years ago relating to HRT and some of the side effects of taking that treatment. One of the biggest headlines that perhaps came out of that study was the fact that taking HRT can increase your risk of developing breast cancer at a later date. What were some of your thoughts about, the results and findings of that research? I know that some of the headlines that came from that and that were widely publicised in the press have unfortunately led to some taboos about talking about HRT, and a lot of women feel uncomfortable sharing that information with other people. What do you think can be done to sort of break down some of those barriers when it comes to having the discussions, whether it's with other people or sort of health professionals?
I think research and evidence, because my problem was I also had a mother who had gone on HRT and had developed breast cancer that was estrogen fed. So was absolutely convinced that it was her HRT that had caused her breast cancer. So not only had I got a family member telling me HRT is really bad, don't go on HRT because it gives you breast cancer. I'd also years later then seen a doctor who had said the same, that there is a concern that it raises your risk of breast cancer. And having my mother had a mastectomy and had quite a tough time with breast cancer, and then subsequently still had 2 other episodes of breast cancer. I think that's the problem. We're at the start of the journey of thorough, proper research that does prove whether there is a causal link or not. And I think the transdermal method of estrogen, there is so little evidence that has any impact on increasing your risk of breast cancer. In fact, I think drinking a couple of glasses of wine will increase your risk more than taking a transdermal version of estrogen. So I think that's what needs to go out there. And I think your Liz Earle, your Davina McCall, your Lisa Snowdon, your Loose Women, they are all of women of that sort of age pushing and trying to get that research and that information that's factually correct out there.
So you sort of talked a little bit about when you were going through things like night sweats and bits like that, and how you had the fan obviously to try and combat that. What were some of the other techniques that you used to try and help with the MS and menopause symptoms?
Oh my goodness. Well, layered clothing, change of clothing, 2 or 3 showers a day, cool showers. I also tried Wim Hof and doing the cold water immersion and the breathing, and that did help. Although I don't know if anybody else has got MS and don't want Wim Hof, but if you're in the middle of a relapse and try and do the Wim Hof breathing, the pain is excruciating in your body, excruciating. So I wouldn't advise it. Obviously, that's quite alternative. I even had a fan at work under my desk that I used to have switched on, that I nicked from, I think we must have had a hot summer once, and it had been in the staff room, and I nicked this fan and stuck it under my desk. I had my whole room as a fridge. My whole house was a fridge. People used to come in and put coats on. So layered clothing. So the heat was a real problem. For me, the heat was a real problem. So cool bath, anything to keep myself cool. Started using talcum powder. I like my granny used to use. Now I know why. To try and soak up the dampness. So that was a real problem. Diet, I changed my diet. Really, I took dairy out of my diet totally. I seem to feel that, for me, I feel dairy is an inflammation. I don't think I'm allergic or anything like that, nothing dramatic, but I feel it just doesn't sit well with me for some reason. And it's I don't know, I feel very sluggish. I love cheese. But I do notice if I have a lot of dairy, I do notice the difference. So that I did change that. What other things did I do? Diet, nutrition, exercise, massive. So obviously background PE, but exercise with an MS can be quite interesting. So I started exercising more regularly in a more weight-bearing way because of the possibility of the osteoporosis and that sort of thing. And I think that does help. And it also helps with the MS. So I now follow an MS style of exercise program online that I've subscribed to. And I can tell when I do that, I can feel the difference. It's very mind and body, and you really have to work through the exercises and think about them. And I think that brain muscle connection is what we lose. And I think that's really vital. So diet, exercise, meditation. Right. So I'm not very good at that. And I don't know anybody who is. Everybody I speak to says, no, I know exactly what you mean. You know, when they say to you, think of nothing, what happens? Millions of thoughts crowding into your mind. And you go, yeah, just let them pass, but I do get sidetracked by them. So I do find that really hard. So instead of doing the meditation, that's where I turn to the Wim Hof, which was more the breathing. So that I actually had something to think about. Because if I have something to concentrate on, I can concentrate. What I couldn't do was just think of nothing. It just didn't work for me. So I tried the I actually found it quite good. Was it called Headspace? I found that quite good. I liked the voice on the Headspace, and I liked the way it just said it's traffic passing you by, let it pass. So I did do that for a bit, but then I found Wim Hof better for me because I was actually physically doing something. I was making myself breathe carefully and slowly and thinking about my breathing. So that was really good. And then the other thing that was massive for me is I went online and went into a sort of community of people talking about the menopause, talking about MS, but tried to make sure that the people I connected with were people that were positive and proactive and not negative, because I think it's quite easy to get drawn into that downward cycle as well as a positive cycle. And it's also, I think, you have to be really careful because it's a bit like talking to your children, isn't it? You don't quite know who you're talking to. So you take what's said or suggested with a pinch of salt, but equally, there are some good suggestions and good people out there, I think.
Did you find a specific group for people with menopause and MS, or was it just some of the wider groups that are around?
I think we've made a group of like-minded, so it was just basically, throw your net out, cast your line into the ether, and gradually you sort of filter out the ones. So there's sort of like a core of us now that sort of liaise and talk and share with each other, symptoms, ideas, suggestions, things that have gone well, things that haven't gone well. And I think as a woman, that support network is vital, because you do feel very alone, because I think it's probably similar to adolescence and turning into a woman at the start of your journey. It's a really, frightening's too strong a word, but it's a really unsettling time. It is unsettling. And I think having people that feel unsettled like you feel is really important.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, comparing it to adolescence, if you look at that, you get, lessons at school in it, you get support from your parents, there's books, there's sort of all these different resources around it, whereas menopause is sort of quietly hidden away, and then it happens, and then you might, if you're lucky, you might meet people who will share their experiences. But I think that's why it's so important for us, obviously, to be having this discussion now and raising awareness of it.
Well, as a teacher for 30 years in a secondary school, I never once talked about the menopause in my PSHE lessons. Not once. It was never on the curriculum. The only time I think it was vaguely mentioned in any context was because the shocking thing about that fact, and that is a fact, that is my personal experience, the shocking thing about that was a lot of the girls I taught, their mothers would have been going through the menopause, and yet it wasn't discussed. So what you would deal with is the fallout of a mother and a family dealing with somebody going through the menopause, and the daughter going through adolescence and burgeoning into being a woman. And the conflict that brings, particularly between the females in the family, And yet we never actually talked and recognised that probably the mother was really struggling. You know, you get a really anxious mummy coming in to talk about their daughter and how difficult their daughter's being, and that there was no relationship, and they were shouting at each other, and they didn't. And actually, it's 50-50, because some of that will have been probably the mum with possible menopausal stress and anxiety and confusion going on herself, and yet no help was being given to the mum. It was a case of, you know, the mum was, and the family dynamics were, you know, that's a problem, but actually we've got to deal with the child that's, you know, causing all this. And probably it was maybe a bit of both.
So did you find, you know, some people say that going through the menopause has a negative impact on their mental health? Was this something you found affected you?
Huge. I ended up giving up work, so I had to give up teaching just before the start of COVID. And although it was probably the right decision from my MS perspective, I think my menopause played a huge contributory factor to that. And I've totally lost my identity. Who am I? You know, I'm what do you do? I'm retired on ill health. That's my identity now. That's hard. That has a huge impact. And I've kept saying to my husband, I think I really need to speak to somebody as a counselling, you know, actually speak to somebody and talk through what I'm doing, you know, where I'm going. And I think that's why I set up my Instagram account with the on MS and the menopause, because I just, there was nothing. I just was totally, I'd lost all sense of self. And also, you know, I don't know how many ladies you've talked to, but my whole relationship with my family, my husband, everything went into crisis because I just lost who I was. And anxiety, we talk about mental health, we talk about this, but unless you've actually experienced anxiety and unless you've lived it, you have no idea. I mean, I've trained as counselling. I've done all sorts of relate work, and you know, working with adolescents, and you know, you talk authoritatively and you're supportive, but actually, when you've been there and walked in those shoes, gosh, do you understand it? It is totally irrational. It is totally different to what the theory makes you believe. You think you're empathetic, but when you've been through it and are in it, you are empathetic.
And before you obviously gave up work, did you have those conversations with the school or anything about how you were feeling? Did they offer any support or guidance? Or
okay, so I worked in an all boys school at the end, so that was really hard. I mean, it was all a joke. It was all a joke. It was, and that's the way, you know, I am. That's my personality. You know, when I'm very worried or upset or nervous, I'll laugh. I'll talk nonstop and I'll laugh, because that's my protection. It's a bit like being a comedian, isn't it? They're usually quite shy, introverted people. So it was my joke. So my joke was I would have a freezing room. I would make the comment when anybody came into the room, yes, I know there's a fan going, you know, hold on to your hat sort of thing. Make sure your wig's, you know, plastered on properly, because you're going to walk into a gale. I would set that out first, because it just felt like I was being a silly woman. And I think that is a problem for women. I think it's the same stigma with mental health. It's admitting to and it's the same with MS, because it's invisible quite often. If I go into an accessible toilet, the looks I get coming out of that accessible toilet are horrific. I mean, to the point where I wouldn't even go to the pantomime a couple of years ago with my husband, because I was petrified that I would need to go to the toilet. And I was petrified of walking in front of people with children, little children, and looking like I was pushing past the queue, because I don't look like I need an accessible toilet. And I think MS is very similar to that. The menopause is very similar to that. It's almost like being a silly little woman. And it was really my husband that said to me, enough's enough, that made me realise I needed to get help.
Do you think that plays into the taboo of not talking about the menopause as well? Obviously, you just feel like you don't want to draw attention, like women feel like they don't want to draw attention to themselves, or
maybe part of it is to do with the aging process and admitting that, you know, that because it is your next stage. I don't know. That wasn't for me. That wasn't my issue. It's more that it's hidden. You can't see it. I mean, they could see the sweating, but then that's embarrassing. Dripping is embarrassing. You know, it's not something that people look at and, oh dear me, or you're not, you know, have a sit down. It's like, oh my gosh, you know, you went to shake somebody's hand and your hand's wet. It's not nice, is it? So I think it's that's the taboo. It's dealing with excretions, dealing with that dirty side of being a human. And I genuinely don't mean we're dirty, but the biological side of being a human. And also it's hidden. You know, you look at somebody who's in the menopause and you don't go, oh, she's in the menopause. Oh, you know, it's hidden, isn't it? And it's a side that we don't, I don't know, it's like mental health. It's a real, we're very good with a broken leg and somebody's got a plaster on. We're really good with that and making sure that they're comfortable and they're okay and their leg's in the right place and nobody's going to trip over it. We're really good at that as a society, but we're not, it's disability, not accessibility. That's what needs to change. And I think it's the same for MS, for the menopause, for any chronic condition. I have a friend who is double bagged. And you know, to all intents and purposes, she looks absolutely fine, but she is dealing with, you know, a lot of issues around, you know, facilities, and without literally lifting up the top and going, you know, do you want to let me in now? So and that's where we have the problem. We're not kind in that way, are we? We're not kind. We I don't know what man is ultimately selfish, I suppose.
So just to finish up, really, according to Davina McCall's Channel 4 documentary, which was Sex Myths and the Menopause, there are currently around 13 million people all going through the menopause. What advice would you give to others currently going through it, or perhaps think they may be?
Reach out for support. And if you don't get that from your GP, find another GP. And I mean, I paid privately, but I was in the position where I felt that was money I could afford to pay to go and see somebody. But things that you're like what you're doing now, I think are vital, and to look and to do the research, and don't just do one piece of research and believe in that. Try and get that fuller picture. Try and look at different sources, not just the same. If you only go to one outlet and one source, you're going to get a really biased and one-sided view. I think there needs to be much, much more research. But if you are going through what I went through and you can try HRT and have the confidence to try it, then I would. It's life-changing.
Now, if this was a commercial podcast, here's where there would be an advert. But as we're a charity, we don't do that. So instead, we'd like to take this opportunity to tell you all about our fantastic resources for people with MS.
Our website, which is mstrust.org.uk, has tons of information and resources for people affected by MS. And we even have a section in our A to Z about menopause. So head over to our website and click on our A to Z and then head to M for menopause.
And now here's consultant neurologist Ruth Dobson to tell us more about MS and menopause. So today I am here with Ruth Dobson, who's kindly agreed to speak to us a little bit about MS and menopause. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, nice to speak to you today.
So starting off, shall we start at the beginning? Could you tell us a little bit about what is menopause and perimenopause and maybe how it sort of affects MS?
Yeah, so menopause and perimenopause is, certainly menopause is a stage of life that all people who have periods go through. So most women will go through the menopause at life. Whether this is biological, so when ovulation stops, period stops and hormones changes, or whether this occurs earlier as a result of surgical menopause, for example, if somebody's ovaries are removed for other reasons, such as during a hysterectomy or for cancer treatment. And what we really mean by menopause is the biochemical changes that are associated, or the biological changes that are associated with stopping ovulation. And alongside all of these hormonal and biological changes, there are a huge number of physical symptoms that people go through and develop. And those physical symptoms, whilst there's sort of almost a list as long as your arm, I think it's really important to remember that just the same as MS, those symptoms aren't the same in everyone. So if you talk to 20 people who've been through the menopause, you'll get 20 different answers about what it is, although there's common features that lots of people experience. But there's no real thing that absolutely everybody has, other than the sort of biological fact that they stop ovulating. Perimenopause is the time around the menopause. So, around that time, as the hormone levels are fluctuating, people develop all kinds of physical, biological symptoms as hormones change gradually in the body. And this can go on for some time, and some people notice almost nothing. Other people can notice really persistent and potentially disabling symptoms that go on for a very long time.
So obviously, when we look at symptoms that occur with menopause, there seems to be an awful lot of overlap between symptoms that are similar to MS symptoms. So how can we know what's what, and how can we make sure that we get the right treatment for it?
It's really, really hard is the first answer. And I'm not saying that in a way to sort of fob people off, but actually to say it can be really, really hard to tell the difference. And sometimes the only way that we have to tell the difference is to treat them as if they come from one cause, see what happens. If that's not working, or if it's not fully getting on top of the on top of those symptoms, treat the other cause, consider treating both. And one example, I think, is urinary symptoms that women, we know that urinary symptoms are really common in MS. We know that women living with MS can get lots of urinary urgency, urge incontinence, various urinary symptoms, but also in association with the low estrogen levels during menopause. Women can get lots of urinary symptoms, and they can get urgency, and they can get urge incontinence. And sometimes it can be, for example, that women are treated repeatedly for urinary tract infections, but actually these aren't infections. These are menopausal type symptoms. So it's a case really of taking everything as an individual and saying, well, this treatment isn't working, maybe it's something else. And I think it's really important to say, not to assume that everything is MS. And I think that's a pattern that often healthcare providers may fall into.
Yeah.
But also not assuming that everything is menopause, because there may be a different explanation. So I think it's really about challenging your assumptions and saying, well, this, I've tried this treatment for UTIs and they keep coming back and back and back. Well, maybe the treatment's wrong. Maybe, maybe go right back to the beginning. I know that lots of women living with MS have said that they feel very fobbed off about menopause. And actually, this is something that's not purely related to MS. Lots of women in general report feeling very fobbed off by healthcare providers around menopause. That, the impact of menopause on life historically has really been kind of underestimated. So don't worry about it, it's nothing, it'll pass. I think there is starting to be a bit of a change around attitudes to that. But I think sometimes it is about finding the right healthcare practitioner as well. And speaking as a doctor, one of the things that's nice about being a doctor is that all my patients are different, everyone's different, and I think similarly all doctors are different. So there may be an element of finding the right GP or the right healthcare practitioner within your practice, within your available network, who can really help you to explore some of this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I will just talk from a personal perspective, because last year I started having a bit more of kind of bladder issues, and I first my protocol was to talk to my MS nurse about it, but then I suddenly started thinking, hang on, everybody's talking about perimenopausal things and stuff. So I sort of mentioned as well, and I'm 44, and I sort of almost got that little reaction that, oh, it was too early when I spoke to the GP, and I kind of thought, well, no, because I got friends who are younger than me who are going through it. So it just seems to still seem, even though we're talking more about it, it still seems to be a little bit of preconceptions that it's not.
I think there's huge numbers of preconceptions. I really do, and I think that these things take time as well for these preconceptions to break down. I know that's not much help for people that are going through the midst of things now, or sort of have been, but to sort of take a slightly different analogy around pregnancy, nobody was really thinking about pregnancy and MS in terms of healthcare providers, in terms of MS neurologists. It wasn't as talked about, I think, 10, 15 years ago as it is now. So I think that sea change is upon us, and actually the more we talk about it, the more we sort of push the issue, actually we will start to see change. And I think that comes from all angles. It comes from people like me, from doctors, but it also comes from sort of the media, how much these things are talked about in the media, and it also comes from sort of patients bringing it up and not being embarrassed or worried about talking about these things with their doctors.
So I guess to sort of be persistent and keep on pushing a little bit.
Yeah, it can feel very, very hard, and it can feel very uncomfortable. And I think, lots of people feel like it's not a nice thing to do. But I also think that, I mean, the thing about menopausal symptoms is that a lot of the symptoms are very treatable.
Yeah.
This is, this is something that actually can be treated. Yeah. And actually the treatment of menopausal symptoms for a lot of women is far more successful than the treatment of MS symptoms.
Yeah.
It sort of pains me to say that as an MS neurologist, but it's true.
Yeah.
Actually, you can have a far bigger impact on somebody's quality of life from treating menopausal symptoms than you can from treating their MS symptoms, simply because the treatments are more effective.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one reason maybe why it's worth sort of really being a little bit persistent and speaking up. And what was interesting is within the past year, I've done talks about MS and menopause, and I think the more you talk about it, actually it does change people's attitudes.
Yeah. Well, I think this sort of information, I mean, it armed me a bit when I went to the doctor, because often when there is a bit of an issue, like increased brain fog or suddenly this bladder problem, I just kind of think, oh well, it is just the MS. But then I suddenly thought, well, hang on, if I can go and talk, and if there is any treatment, maybe that could sort of improve everything. So it definitely, all the sort of chatting about it has made me feel a bit more sort of more knowledge that hopefully I can fight it with.
Yeah, I think that's that. And I think living with MS makes a lot of people very good advocates for their own healthcare, because you have to be. In a lot of ways, people do have to advocate for their health. They do have to report. So you are starting from a position where people sort of know how to advocate for their healthcare, and actually maybe using that sort of those bits that you haven't wanted to learn, but you've had to learn as part of your MS, to say that this isn't right. This isn't right. And, this really is, what could be going on. And this is what I think it is.
Yeah. If we mention treatments, obviously the big sort of buzzword at the moment is HRT. And there's been a bit of ups and downs with this previously. What's the opinion within the MS world? So the lady that we spoke to before in the interview, she said that her neurologist was a bit meh about the idea of treating with HRT, didn't really know whether it would be useful or not. And the GP was very much, no, you shouldn't. There's, breast cancer links and so on. What's sort of the general opinion in the world of MS about HRT?
So I'm not going to give you the general opinion in the world of MS, because I think, as we all know, still an overwhelming number of MS neurologists are males and don't really hold an opinion about this.
Yeah.
It's outside what we would normally deal with in the neurology clinic. What I think is important to know is that the studies linking HRT with breast cancer risk and other similar studies were really based on very early formulations of HRT. So they were based on formulations of HRT that had really quite hefty doses of hormone within them. And over the past 15 years since these studies, really the field has become so much more refined. And the treatments have become so much more refined and really tailored to particular symptom groups, tailored to how to build things up, how to really, start to move towards personalized therapy for menopause. And probably the risks are overstated. It's not saying the risk is zero. It's not saying there's no risk. But when you're talking about chronic and disabling symptoms, I think the risks are much lower than that's been sort of publicly stated previously, and that the treatments are kind of much, as I said, much more refined. So I don't think it's a hard no really to almost anyone. So one of the things about medicine is we never say always.
Yeah, of course.
But I'd say in the overwhelming majority of people, actually there will be an HRT formulation that is right for that person.
Oh, that's interesting. So there's nothing that we need to, as a sort of MS patients, need to worry about when it comes to disease-modifying drugs or any of the other more sort of common medications that we tend to be on.
So I mean, I think the only sort of small notes of caution, and they really are very small notes of caution. We know that, for example, if people are having lots of tummy upset on Tecfidera, it can interfere with how other tablets are absorbed. So that's a particular worry with hormonal contraception. Now for HRT, it's kind of less of a worry. You're using it for a different reason. So it doesn't matter so much if you only get 90% of it rather than all of it. Obviously, if you're using a contraceptive pill, you want to have all of that in you to get the contraceptive effect. So I think that's sort of, it's things like that, but within your body, the two don't interact to the best of our knowledge. And there are all kinds of topical HRT preparations as well that can be used for specific symptoms, such as specific urinary symptoms that really don't interact with any DMTs at all. One of the benefits of HRT is it has bone protecting effects. So HRT protects against bone thinning and potential osteoporosis. And we know that MS is associated with slightly thinner bones on average. So actually that's another reason to sort of really try and push for it. So you can potentially, particularly if you are falling or at risk of falls or tripping or stumbling, actually I'd say that it's probably quite important to really think about taking this.
Yeah. Well, that's again an interesting connection. So when it comes to sort of natural remedies or things that we can try ourselves, in the Vina documentary. Now there is other documentaries and other things out there as well, but it seems like half of the population has watched this documentary. She talks a lot about exercise and the benefits of that. They talk about things like yoga and cold water swimming and all sorts of things. Do you think that exercise is something that sort of can help with menopause? We know that there's benefits for people with MS to try and do exercise.
I think exercise is good for everyone. I think exercise means different things to different people. So when I say exercise, I don't mean going out and running a marathon. I mean finding a kind of, sustainable and enjoyable way of getting active that works for you. And that is very different for different people again. And I think that, this moves away from science, but I feel particularly that sort of open water swimming, outside swimming, I personally find particularly beneficial, just in terms of mental health, and it's a nice, sustainable way for me to exercise. That's going to vary between different people. But I do think that sort of keeping physically active as you are able to has benefits outside of the kind of physical benefits. It's got mental health benefits. And it's got to be the right exercise for that person. It's got to be something that you enjoy. If you're sort of dragging yourself out and feeling miserable before, during, and after, then that's not the right. You've not found the right thing for you.
So if we're talking about finding the exercise, obviously if you're struggling, if you've got mobility problems, I guess the exercise is sort of a case of just trying to find what works for you as well.
I mean, I think for mobility issues, so many forms of exercise are adaptable, I think is the first thing to say.
Yeah.
So, I know there's really good kind of seated Zumba even. I mean, Zumba you would think would be the least adaptable form of exercise. It's dancing and jumping around. Yet there are seated versions of Zumba that you can do. Swimming is one that in terms of limited mobility is actually very feasible for many people.
Yeah.
Similarly, kind of yoga, Pilates, there are seated versions of many of these forms of exercise. So it's actually, and it's not, as I said earlier, not just to do with the sort of cardiovascular fitness aspect of it, but it's to do with the rest, the sort of the very holistic approach as well around it.
I've seen a lot of things about the benefits of strength training, sort of moving away from cardio to more strength things.
Exactly, and I think things like sort of seated Pilates, seated yoga are brilliant at maintaining flexibility, at maintaining range of movement, at maintaining strength, even if you can't, bend backwards and touch your toes, sort of through your legs and get into all these funny postures. There are still, this is not about getting into those strange postures. It's actually about maintaining your strength, maintaining your sort of your flexibility, and that's beneficial whatever you're starting from.
So obviously talking about exercise and the sort of when you get hot and you get raised body heat, one of the few things I knew about menopause before anything was spoken about was the sort of hot flushes. How, not just for when we're doing exercise, but obviously how much does that affect Emma's symptoms, the hot flushes?
So I think hot flushes is the thing that springs to mind whenever anyone thinks of menopause, isn't it? I think if you went and asked 20 people in the street what symptoms do people get with menopause, you'd get sort of 19 hot flushes at least. And I think that we know that sort of that increased body heat can make MS symptoms worse. It's temporary. It's while the body heat is up. It's not representative. It doesn't mean that the MS is definitely getting worse. But even outside of MS, those hot flushes can be one of the most disabling symptoms of menopause for a lot of women. And that they are one that is treatable, I think, is the first thing. I see your point about, if you're getting hot through exercise, that can make things worse, and you get hot flushes and that can make things worse. I think there's an element of seeing how it's going. I think the hot flushes associated with menopause tend to be sort of more random, more unpredictable. They occur at odd times. So I think it's sort of separate from the heat that you would get, the raise in body temperature you get during exercise. And I think a lot of people living with MS kind of know how to get around that in terms of their exercise, or have found ways of getting around that, or have found ways of coping with that, or have found that they can go this far but not further. I have a number of patients who feel they can run a certain distance, and after that's when the sort of MS symptoms start to kick in again. So it's about knowing your body as well, and knowing what you can do, and working sort of within that, and pushing it if you want to push it, not pushing it if you don't want to push it, but being mindful about your body and about your symptoms. And
you mentioned that the hot flushes are treatable. So because I seem to think that this is something people just suffer in silence. So if you are struggling, you should be talking to your GP.
Absolutely. So I think, if you're struggling, you should talk to your GP, I think. And if you're not getting anywhere talking to your GP, then maybe try talking to a different GP at the practice. MS nurses, I think, I know I'm coming to the MS Trust to talk to the MS nurses in March about menopause and about the management of menopause. So I think they are I think a lot of them actually are interested in it, and I think they're very interested in sort of upskilling and learning more about this. So I think it is about raising it and talking with people.
It's interesting because one thing that I've heard in a lot of podcasts and documentaries about menopause, because I've been cramming the subject now, is that nobody spoke about it in school at all, and there's not talked about. And they were saying there's often like a lot of these girls that go to school have mothers that are going through it as they're in school, and there can be this clash between hormones in the house and nobody talks about it. And it was quite interesting. But again, all this chatting about it is for everyone's benefit, even for people who are not going to go through the menopause, I would say. So they
know,
yeah.
They're aware.
Yeah. I live in a house full of boys, and I think, they need to know why mummy is going slightly crazy at times. Is there any other tips for women dealing with sort of menopausal problems, or, MS being affected by menopause?
I think in terms of tips, it's about knowing your body, and it's about knowing yourself and knowing your MS, and trying to remain as sort of outside of the MS as fit and healthy as you're able. And I think lots of people talk about the benefits of various different diets for MS symptoms, for menopausal symptoms, for this, for that. It's very hard to get evidence for diets. My personal feeling is actually, if you're having a balanced, healthy diet, be that vegetarian, be it not vegetarian, be it, whatever works for people, but it's about balance and healthiness, not sort of being very restrictive.
Yeah.
And also not, making those healthier choices. And as we talked about earlier, remaining as kind of physically active as you're able to, rather than exercise. I think physically active is maybe a better term. And I think not suffering in silence as well, because I think this is something that a lot of women have suffered in silence.
Yeah.
And it is, a lot of the symptoms are very treatable.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the key, is that these symptoms are treatable. And I think, sometimes if people are not getting anywhere, or they're finding that, people are saying, well, no, you can't have this, the sort of association with bone health and MS and things actually can be quite a useful one to use to say, look, this is a reason to go on HRT if you're finding yourself having to convince people about that. But I think things are changing slightly.
I like the fact that you're going to talk to the MS nurses at our conference about it as well, because I guess that means that if women do approach their MS nurses, maybe they can help them with some information to go to their GP as well to continue chatting.
Yeah, I think that's it, and I think it is about getting, people, because I think a big bit of it is that people aren't really comfortable talking about it.
Yeah.
I think that's changing. I think it's changing, and I think it's changing quite quickly, and I think that will help more than anything else.
I agree with you on that one. I mean, if you would have told me even just 5 years ago that I would admit on a podcast that I got bladder issues, I would have not thought that was something I would ever do. But it's just the more we talk about it, the more normal it gets.
Yeah, I think that's it. And the more normal it gets, the more sort of people are able to talk about it, and you enter this kind of almost self-fulfilling prophecy.
Here's another question that I see come up a lot: the sort of lack of research when it comes to just menopause. But how about research with menopause and MS? Because I guess there's some research that's been done into hormones and MS.
There's relatively little about MS and menopause, actually. When you look into the sort of published literature, there's relatively little, and I think this partly comes back to it being something that's not really been spoken about, not really been thought about. And one of the things is that it hasn't been that. One of the things is it's been quite difficult to study. And I sort of go back to my first point that, all people who have periods, all people who ovulate will go through the menopause at some point. So how do you compare people who are going through the menopause from people who aren't? Because everybody, all women go through it. There's big biological differences between people who do go through menopause and people who don't. So sort of looking at changes that occur around the menopause becomes kind of really tricky to do. As opposed to other things, you're thinking about pregnancy. Well, you can say this person's pregnant, this person's could be pregnant, but they're not. So you can compare them, if you like. Whereas menopause, it's far, far more tricky. I think that's one reason. I think that, and the menopause sort of coincides when lots of people find that MS changes anyway. And there are lots of immune system changes that we know that happen with age in men and women, in everyone. Our immune system changes with age. So, and sort of teasing out the impact of the menopause from those changes that occur during aging. Well, in most people who go through menopause, it's associated with aging. So how do you pull that out all apart? It's actually incredibly difficult to do so. And it's incredibly difficult to do so as well when different people get very different symptoms associated with this, and sort of to try and come up with answers. What's really exciting actually is we've actually just advertised yesterday for a PhD student to come work with me to actually start looking at this in a bit more detail and sort of really try and delve into how women with MS experience the menopause, how people think about sort of risks and benefits of treatments, and the impact of those symptoms on their MS, on the menopause, on sort of the interplay between that, and trying to look at some of these factors around MS changes around menopause. So I think, and I think more and more people are becoming interested in it. So I think there's not much there at the moment, but I hope over the next few years there'll be a bit more. That
sounds exciting. So once, obviously this is early days, but is there anything that sort of people with MS can get involved with? Where should they be looking for the information to get involved, if there will be some in the future?
so I think, the sort of, it comes down to the usual suspects, doesn't it? The sort of social media and often with this kind of studies that I do, when I'm looking, people go through, people like the MS Trust, the MS Society, get them to engage, because actually it's about doing stuff that means something to, big numbers of the MS community, not just the patients that I treat in East London. So sort of going through those. So it's a case of really keeping your eyes open. But it's a little bit of time off, but we're looking to really start some nice work on that.
Well, we'll have to keep in touch, and you let me know. And we shall certainly advertise it on the MS Trust website and social media, because this is sounds exciting. Right. So my sort of final question for people who are eventually going to hit menopause or perimenopause, how can we, as people with MS, how can we prepare? Can we prepare?
I think that I find that a really tricky question, in all honesty, because normally I say, being somebody living with MS, you have to be a bit more organized, you have to be a bit more prepared. It doesn't change what you can do. You sort of, with a bit of organization, actually you can do the things that you were always intending to do. I think almost the problem with menopause, perimenopause, you don't exactly know when it's going to come. You don't exactly know what it's going to be like. So it's almost impossible. It's sort of like a known unknown. To sort of quote Donald Rumsfeld. There's a lot of truth in that sentence, but this is one of your known unknowns. You don't know what it's going to be like, and so there's actually probably very little that you can do to prepare, unfortunately. Other than hope that you're one of those people that it's not so bad. And I think the other thing is really there are various kind of menopause symptom checklists that you can use, and just to sort of be aware that if your MS symptoms are all going awry, are you sure it's your MS? It's, assuming it's your MS is a really reasonable first port of call. But if things just don't feel quite right, then just think about it, I guess, is the one thing that you can do to prepare.
And I guess that's the thing with people with MS. Quite often we just put things down to MS, but it might not always be. So not just with menopause, but other things as well.
Exactly. So, I think it's really normal, and I think it's really sensible in a way to, always have your first assumption being, this is my MS playing up, this is what it is. Don't always assume.
No.
There might be something else treatable going on. I think that's probably the best preparation, but I think it's not really something that you can prepare for that well.
But hopefully there will be more information to read.
And I think there's more and more talk and more chatter, and there's going to be more and more information over time.
And I think the one thing that I can take away from this is just don't sit quiet, but actually do speak up and talk to someone.
And I think talk to someone. Lots of people have to advocate for themselves, but also there's something about sort of almost paying it forward. So even if you're not able, if you feel, well, oh, I wish I'd done that, then you can still be part of those kind of conversations and actually get more people talking about these things.
Excellent. Thank you so much for talking to us today. I think this
No
has
worries.
been very
Lovely
interesting.
To speak to you.
And let us know how the project goes on, and we will might do another podcast in the future too, so you can tell us how it's going.
Brilliant. I'd love to.
Yes, I think it was really interesting, obviously, to hear from both of our guests this week. Especially, some of the points that Ruth raised were really interesting. How she said that you can't always assume that everything that's going on with your body is MS related just because you do have MS, but at the same time, if you're going through the menopause, don't necessarily assume that that's a menopause thing either.
Yeah, I think a lot of the messages from both conversations was sort of the takeaway that we should not be sitting and suffering in silence. Even if it's MS or if it's menopause, just speak up about it, because I think too often we sort of just think that, oh, well, there's nothing that can be done about it. But the fact that she was saying, Ruth was saying that there is a lot of issues that can be treated, which, I think a lot of people just kind of think, well, it's embarrassing to talk about and they're not going to do anything about it, so I might as well just, try and get on with it. And then they're feeling miserable and horrible. And I think, I did mention it when I was saying to Ruth that, 5 years ago, I would not like to sit and talk about having bladder issues myself. But I feel like, the more I normalize it, the more I talk about it and don't feel ashamed that is something that I have been struggling with, then hopefully more people can talk about it. And I think it has become less of a stigma. So I feel like hopefully when we do the same about MS and menopause, it would be the same. And, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot now, but I feel quite hot about this topic because I'm turning 45 this year and I'm sort of heading into perimenopausal territory. I definitely feel like I mentioned when I was chatting to Ruth that I had some bladder issues. And also my brain fog has been so bad. You weren't in the same meeting as me yesterday, but there was a meeting I had where the thing that I was trying to say disappeared like 5 times. It was like I saw it, if you drop a soap in your bathtub and you're trying to catch it and you see it and then it goes again. And it was exactly like that. I saw the thing that I was going to say and it went. And it was so frustrating me. So I was having a little rant afterwards to my husband and I was kind of saying, well, maybe this could be treated. Maybe it is just menopause that's causing this more than just the MS cognition. But who knows? But I think the way to sort of get to the bottom of it is actually to start talking to a health professional rather than ranting to my husband. But when I was struggling last year, I did sort of talk to both my GP and to an MS nurse. So I'm currently waiting to have some scans to see, like, the whole bladder issues. But yeah, I kind of want to get the ball rolling and seeing whether I should be starting to take HRT. It's embarrassing things to talk about. And I feel also when you open yourself up to say that these are things that are going wrong with you, that my mind is going or what have you, you open yourself open for judgment as well. And people kind of say, well, Helena, she's losing the plot, isn't she? And that's not a nice situation to do. So yeah, again, it's that word, normalize it, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. Obviously, it's still a little bit of a taboo, but hopefully the more we talk about it, the more we can break down some of those barriers and more people will feel comfortable with having those conversations. It happens throughout a lot of people's lives, whether it's women or other people too. When you first have your period, people make that a bit of a taboo, and then you get to the end of having your period and that's also a taboo. So at what point do we start having those conversations?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I feel like it makes me think a lot about the older generation, like my mom and my grandmother, where it wasn't talked about and like how they must have really suffered because it just wasn't discussed. And I think it was very interesting what they were talking about, being schools and being teachers, and that we don't talk about it in the school yet. Yes, the children in the school, there are several there that obviously will go through menopause, and there will also be lots of children there whose parent is going through menopause. So again, I don't have daughters, I have 2 sons, but I do want to talk about it because they need to know what's going on and what's happening. So yeah, we just talk.
Yeah, so speaking of talking, if you've gone through menopause yourself or perimenopause, or perhaps going through them at the moment and you'd like to share your story, do get in touch with us at mystory@mstrust.org.uk. And also remember that if you've got any questions about MS, whether it's menopause related or not, we're here for you. Our inquiry service is available Monday to Friday, except on UK bank holidays, and that's from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Outside of these hours, you're welcome to leave us a message and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So our inquiry service number is 0800 032 38 39, or you can email us on ask@mstrust.org.uk.
And you can also find us on social media. So on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can find this podcast on Spotify, Google, Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music. And get in touch with us. We want to hear from you. And, like and subscribe this podcast, spread the word, let other people know, let them know about that the MS Trust is joining the MS and menopause revolution. And so, come and talk to us about it. And we would like to say a big thank you to Anne Chapman Audio for the music of this podcast. And see you in a few weeks. Bye.
Bye.